Carleton University of Canada, and José Ratton from Federal University of Pernambuco in Brazil. And the paper is called A Prison Rebellion in Brazil, a Theory of Order Beyond Self-Governance and the State. And we have a second paper titled Backfiring, the Politics of Containment, Criminal Policies in Southern Brazil, and the Hegemony of the Primeiro Comando da Capital, by Vitor Dieter from University of Kent. We are thinking about 15-20 minutes at more for each paper, and then we have 10 minutes with our discussant, Julienne Weegels from University of Amsterdam. We are then going to return to Jen, Luiz, and Vitor for some answers to the comments and questions done by Julienne. And then, yes, we are going to have a Q&A moment till the end of our session, okay? So, first of all, welcome again, Jen and José Luis, and you are with the.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the capital of my country, my university, the house in which I sit right now, are all situated on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. I'm not doing this as virtue signaling, but I'm doing this as a reminder that the Global South and colonialism are not only to be found in the geographic South. Our paper, I'd like to thank Luiz and Massimo for inviting us. Our paper's name has changed in part because, as you probably know, if you work collectively on papers, that papers are also contingent outcomes of bargains and light conflict. So it changed since we submitted the proposal. The problem: ordering punishment in understated prison regimes. We've talked about this quite a bit in this conference. Prisons in global peripheries are largely blind panopticons, the brilliant expression about a prison in Ecuador by Núñez. Most prisons are, but not all, and this is important too, but most of them are underfunded, understaffed, and overpopulated. Order, as a result of this, becomes a problem for all: politicians, administrators, guards, inmates, and so on. And it therefore requires some form of inmates' involvement. Most prison regimes, therefore, are hybrid. They are joint solutions to the problem of order. Theory, how to think about hybrid carceral regimes. We tried to build an analytical framework because this is part of a research program that we apply to a number of prisons that we want to study. So we're talking in terms of economies of governance, institutional economies, rules and arrangements for definition and enforcement of claims over things and claims over freedoms. Political economy, underlying political structure, distributional implications of the institutional arrangements, and also moral economies, that is the normative embeddedness of both the institutional arrangements and the political structure and distributional implications. We asked questions about effectiveness, level of conflict, level of violence, efficiency, how these results are produced given the investment in resources, broadly understood, social capital, financial, and so on. And finally, rights outcomes. The research, the case is hybrid governance in a Brazilian prison. It's a prison in the interior of Pernambuco. Pernambuco, over the last 25 years, has been one of the most violent states, with one of the most violent metropolis in an extremely violent country, but much more violent than the average Brazilian large cities. It has a fast-growing prison population. We look at one typical prison: underfunded, understaffed, and overpopulated. And we identify changing hybrid governance arrangements. The study is based on extensive interviews with former inmates, with drug sellers in the city, with guards, with rights advocates, and so on. Ratton. Okay, just a summary of the overall results. What we find are very weakly institutionalized and fluid arrangements. We find several quite distinct but always informal arrangements over the last 20 to 25 years. We call them less regimes than regime configurations, or even, this is still under bargaining, regime situations. Informal bargaining is the central component of governance. We have periodic grand bargains and also constant renegotiations. And conflict is a major driver of new bargains. It's important to note that the state and its agents are central players, but a changing and sometimes large set of other actors are also involved in these configurations. Ratton. Okay, key landmarks. Sorry, again, the summary. The first situation is a stable grand bargain where the key elements brought to bear in the bargaining process were charisma, respect, and honor. The second one is decay, tensions, and crises. An institution called the chaveiros, which is a Portuguese word that can be translated by the holders of the keys, if you wish, who are inmates, but I let Ratton explain this. So chaveiros and the limits of state-endorsed extortion. And the third situation, a stable grand bargain, bringing the state partly back in, so a renegotiation. And between situation 2 and 3, we have a major riot. Ratton, you go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. Yeah, the first situation, equilibrium 1, it's about charisma, respect, and honor in Portuguese. And the first one, yes.
Okay, sorry.
And the core bargain of our argument is the prison director and the prisoners have a special relationship. This guy, the director of the prison, is a charismatic outsider, a physician, a social activist that was inside the prison for a long time because he was this human rights activist with a trajectory of inmates' rights advocacy. And it's important to stress that respect and flexible rule, it's so important to understand the dynamics of social order inside the prison. And this kind of thing that there's a kind of honor code all the time, the respect and the relationship between, it's a kind of direct relationship between the director and the inmates. It's very important to understand the rules and the personal rules developed in this context. A second point is it's very functional, effective, and efficient. There's stable, no rebellions, no escapes. There's a kind of situation that's apparently comfortable for all the people in the situation that's very specific. Inmates' rights are enforced. It's important because in this moment it's not allowed to have disrespect to inmate rights. And this director was a champion of the rights in Caruaru, the city where the penitentiary is located, and inside the prison. The fragilities, if you can say, is many tensions with military police, especially with the penitentiary agents and the public, because there's a kind of battle of narratives about the place, the social place, the cultural place of this kind of prison in Caruaru and Pernambuco. Oh, next one, please. Yeah, and we have the second situation. It's not properly equilibrium, but it's a rebellion. It's a rebellion, and very, very huge rebellion with 6 people there. And we are calling decay, tension, and crisis, chaveiros, key holders, and the limits of state-endorsed inmate extortion. We have a prison director and chaveiros, and there's a kind of conflict, the problems, The rules are not clear in this moment, and order enforcement in exchange for autonomy and extortion rights, for space, small commerce, many different markets inside the prison: drug markets, sex markets, food markets, and another kind of healthcare markets. And the role of the chaveiros and the relationship between chaveiros that were chosen for the director, as well for a group of inmates. New direction, it's important to understand, former guards, insiders with limited charisma and legitimacy among inmates. We can notice weak ability to mobilize under codes and more reliance on guards and the police. The material basis of this rebellion or the situation, increasing pressure on the inmates themselves, with growing population, increased extortion rates by chaveiros in these markets that I talked about minutes ago, especially in sections with larger and poorer inmate population. And cats and rats, or sem terra, without land, landless, and the group, a small group of inmates, chaveiros, that was controlling the prison in this moment. Declining effectiveness, stable for a while, but with limited legitimacy of the administrator, limited state resource, growth, hierarchy among inmates, gatos, cats, and versus ratos, rats. It's important to notice that we don't have, it's impossible to recognize factions or gangs in this prison, but it's a kind of informal groups, cats and rats. Each moment has a different kind of groups. It's different from factions like, or gangs like PCC or CV, that's probably of another regions in Brazil, but it's in Northeast states too, but not in this penitentiary. We have a crisis in this moment that starts in Sem Terra landless zone, and there was a militiaman, Chaveiro was killed and mutilated, and prison partially burned down. We have some pictures to show you in this moment. And the family, it's important to understand the architecture of the prison and the special group of the military police that was not inside the prison, but was called to, and when the riot was controlled. And the second part that is, we can observe now in this moment, it's because this riot occurred in 2016, and the equilibrium 2, we call it bringing more of the state back in. We have two core bargains: administrator using the riot to get increased resources from the state. It's important to understand that the position of this administration and the relationship of this guy with the high authorities of the state of Pernambuco, and as well administrator and chaveiros, but with lesser autonomy for extortion, and the role of trust and respect again, but in a different way. Side bargains, administrator and inmates respected this kind of thing about machista demonstration and respectful outsider. The possibility, yeah, when this guy controlled, he was, this guy, the director, was an important agent, penitentiary agent, and he controlled the riot. He showed force to control the riot, but with respect. And the consequence of this moment was this guy is respected, and a respectful outsider, the defendant here, and leveraging resources from outside to increase. Yeah, administration and state level prison administration, prison to guard to prison guard. it's important to understand this difference to explain this new equilibrium. Material basis here, more from the state, less from the mates. It's very interesting, this kind of thing, because the state's here and it's present in another way, and the inmates are not so stressed when as they were in the moment, in the historical moment before the riot, the rebellion. It's important to understand that it's so effective, so functional, this kind of order in this moment, very stable, quite effective, in spite of this of continuing overcrowding in this penitentiary and in the state of Pernambuco. And we have a normative order, as I say, more respect, marginally more rights enforcement, and we have this kind of equilibrium. And this kind of situation before the riot, the rebellion, and after the rebellion, it's very useful to understand the production of social order in prisons in general, but especially in this situation that we are studying. We are studying and are studying and we will study. And it's interesting to produce some kind of theory to understand the basis of social order inside prisons in this condition. And we are discuss this kind of thing in this paper and in other papers.
Okay, a few tentative insights. The state remains a key player in hybrid regimes. The state decides who gets incarcerated, who is sent where. The state decides how much money to devote. The state decides which director will be chosen, and then the director selects, with more or less negotiation with inmates, selects the chaveiro, and then manages their autonomy to extort inmates. So the state remains central. Fluid and informally bargained orders are marginally effective, but they are resilient. I mean, the period of decay that we talk about went on for almost 10 years. Male homicide rate, this is not for that prison, but overall in Pernambuco, it's roughly the same, but overall in Pernambuco, the male homicide rate is 30% lower inside than outside, but it remains extremely high, 60 per 100,000 versus 90. Charisma and respect work. Effective extortion, that's chaveiro. Charisma and respect creates moral hazard. That is, it creates a situation in which the state objectively benefits from providing less resource to the prison. Okay, it creates a situation in which inmates invest, or in which administrators invest personal social capital, charisma, making it work. The general picture is a kind of system that's functional for opportunistic exclusionary democracies, but it's not quite a carceral state. The outlook is problem-solving, opportunistic, populism. Methodological note, Ratton.
Yeah, I would like to notice and to stress that the homicide rates that Jen talked about, it's not male homicide rates. It's interesting to discuss this because in general, when we discuss comparing homicide rates inside and outside the prisons, in general, we use the homicide rates, not male or female homicide rates. It's important to stress this because it's interesting, the difference between these rates. And it's only for include in this moment, it's important to discuss in Brazilian criminology, kind of internal colonialism. It's important to stress that São Paulo and Rio are not Brazil, are Brazil too, but they're not Brazil. It's important, we can't reduce Brazil to the information that we have, academic or not academic information for São Paulo and Rio. The same way, Buenos Aires, not Argentina, or DF, not Mexico, or Bogota and Medellin, not Colombia. And we need to understand, especially in Brazil, but in Latin America in general, the distinct colonial history, distinct legal market dynamics, distinct cultural criminal justice system and the regime of the police in this place. And to decolonize Brazilian criminology, we need to compare the comparables, determined on the basis of one theory, and the list of existing countries, not a theory. For example, it's difficult to compare. For example, Costa Rica and Uruguay with Brazil, and Colombia, Mexico, and Argentina, and Venezuela, for example. And we need to inscribe case in context. The geographies, the proper geographies and temporalities, and the relationships between geographies and temporalities inside the countries. It's important. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Jen and José Luis, for your amazing presentation, but also for making it in 20 minutes. And it's the same for you, Vitor, please. Vitor Dieter is from University of Kent, and her paper is titled Backfiring, the Politics of Containment, Criminal Policies in Southern Brazil and the Hegemony of the Primeiro Comando da Capital. Vitor?
Yes, thank you, Ramiro. Thank you for everyone, Luiz, Ratton, and Jan, for the amazing paper before. Thank you to everyone, and especially to Julienne. We'll have to discuss this later on. And just as Jan started mentioning, when you're writing, co-authoring a paper, things change. But when you're co-authoring a paper with yourself, also things change. So the title itself was quite, I restricted the object of the paper in order to try to make those 20 minutes and not overextend myself. Therefore, I'm restraining myself to the penal politics of containment. And that's why the title is The Politics of Containment, Prison Policies and Discipline in Paraná, Brazil. So let me just start with this mention that when we refer to mass incarceration, there are usually two important pivot cases. We all know this, the US and the UK. And often Brazil is conflated with this model of mass incarceration because Brazil has been undergoing mass incarceration. And it's interesting because the explanation that has been given to the expansion of incarceration, both in the US and the UK, has been quite popularized and has a strong basis on Luiz Wacan's thesis of the punitive containment. He argues that punitive containment is a punitive punishment strategy implemented inseparably for its short-term capacity to hem in disorder, to contain, within the expanded perimeter of the outcast neighborhood and its carceral appendages, so neighborhoods and carceral appendages, and for its broader theatrical value. It's not relatable to crimes, it's a theatrical value in the eyes of middle and upper classes, audiences. This is a claim Wacan make on what punitive containment is. And what's interesting is that this thesis is then extended and has gained quite a lot of popularity in Brazil as well, and in what we call now the global south, but back then the third world, just adapting this to the neoliberal and authoritarian context of third world countries. Would then Brazil be a linear model of this? And according to Wacan, that's exactly the case. Wacan would argue that the Brazilian state strategy of punitive containment is a complement of the deregulation of the economy in the 1990s, and in the context of increased urban violence, the intervention of the police and the judicial apparatus amounts to reestablishing a veritable dictatorship over the poor, right? So we have two things there. One is neoliberalism and authoritarianism on the other hand. And the thing is, what Wacan is doing here, he's making a claim of Brazil that actually goes through four important distinct historical periods, which is the dictatorship. He goes back and says the democracy reinstates that period. And within democracy, he states that the period which claimed the end of dictatorship was overheated, was superseded by neoliberalism, which dramatically affected the other periods, right? But there are four periods that we can clearly identify in terms of politics in Brazilian history. My question is, can we think the politics of containment in prison through this democratic lens? Is it useful, and to what extent is Wacan's hypothesis at all useful? And to that extent, my methods are based on three distinct bases. One is the amount of interviews, of open-ended interviews that I've done with prisoners, prison staff, within prison, NGOs, lawyers, police officers, and authorities, totaling 52 interviews, as well as participant observation. I stayed in a prison, observing a prison, not in a prison. I was luckily not convicted for anything. And I was observing the daily work of the chief of security with inmates in prison for at least 2 months, besides generally observation for 7 months. Besides that, I did archival research to triangulate some of that information with media and legal documents. And in particular here, just like Ratton and Gual were arguing, I don't want to make a claim about Brazil. Actually, my claim is a case study of Paraná, which is a unit of Brazil that says something about Brazil, but not all of it. And this focuses on state in dialogue with the national level. This means that the federal and the state level are in dialogue. There's no relationship of hierarchy here. And therefore, I focus on prison policies in the ground where they were occurring. And if we have to start then with the first period, and I'll be very brief in terms of result, I'll try to summarize them as much as possible. What we have to observe in terms of the dictatorship period, at least what we can get from the archival sources, is that as O'Donnell set the scene, this is a period of state intervention in the economy and society. There's an economic ideology of productivity. There's a condemnation of behaviors that are insubordinate, insolent, undisciplined, disordered, morally wrong. And there's this aspiration of governors in general, gifted to an aspiration of being authority, right? Authority. What does this mean in terms of imprisonment? And if we take a look at a couple of documents from the period, we can see that, for instance, at the parliamentary inquiry of 76, we can see from the analysis there of the inquiry in the middle of the dictatorship, crime was seen as a product of social disorder, which was seen as the opposite of disciplined citizen and a good soldier. That was the criminal, right? The opposite of a disciplined citizen. In addition to that, imprisonment would be criticized by those that were trying to reform prison during the military dictatorship, but with the argument that prison makes prisoners idle or incapable of being resettled, and therefore it would be not so good to incarcerate them as much. It would be better to use them as productive workers in forced camps, for instance, or forced labor. Therefore, forced labor would be preferred even to imprisonment because it does not remove the criminal from its duties towards family and the community. But in terms of the prison regulations there, you can see that there's this clear argument of how autocratic power, and a prison governor in particular in the inquiry said, in reality, in the whole of Brazil, it is more important to change a prison warden, a prison governor, than changing the law. For the prisoner, the change of the warden is more important than the legal act, because the warden is the law, or penitentiaries are little feuds. I have been a feudal lord, right? That's the claim of a prison governor. However, what is important is that there's a transition to democracy, and that happens between 82 and 85. And during that period, there's a change and a dramatic argument for social justice. This, of course, what to our interest, changes the way that arrests work in that period. Just to look at Paraná, which is my case study of the state, you can see that between dictatorship and democracy, there's a huge slump, less attention to the detentions of vagrancy, right? Instead, the focus of the police shifts dramatically towards theft, robberies, and larceny, right? So there's a change from lesser crimes to more judicialized, controlled form of crime, comparing both periods, comparable periods. Another important point here is that there's a new legal framework that is really progressive in this sense. It seeks to judicialize things in a positive humanitarian way. So there's a discourse of humanization. And in particular, if you take a look at the governor of the period and the Secretary of Justice, there's this claim that we should have the politics of humanization, and it should reduce the privation of prisoners to only the deprivation of freedom itself. That's a severe punishment. And this deprivation cannot be further aggravated beyond the terms of the sentence, right? So the idea of humanizing them. The problem, of course, as we all know, is that there was a major economic crisis that did not lead to any actual reform that would adapt and improve prison conditions. On the contrary, as the prison staff was explaining me the conditions of actually ruling prison, the problem was that there were just too many prisoners being sentenced for longer periods, and they had to deal with less staff, with less conditions due to the precariousness of the country, and a huge amount of prisoners. However, they were all quite obedient but organized in gangs. So humanism ended up being a wall of containment in which the discipline of productive labor was reduced, but the containment walls was greatly increased for those within. Secondly, we have then a new period of neoliberalism. And in this period, we have this new form of containment. What does this new period of containment during neoliberalism mean? First is that there's a new legal regime, right? There's a huge human rights laws that are being approved in the country. The country becomes more adapted to human rights discourses. Among them, for instance, the control of military police through civil courts, amongst them the criminalization of torture, which is a police behavior, and also a behavior of prison staff, also makes Brazil part of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. If we take a look at the prison governors and prison staff were claiming that one of the changes was that the prison units that were increasingly being built was trying to distance the prison staff from direct interaction with the prison inmate, and therefore new prison units, which the architecture was meant to reduce interaction and control prisons in a confined space, in confinement. And also interesting that the legal standards here became quite rigid in terms of sentencing, and sentencing got expanded in particular important laws. But as we all know, the period of neoliberalism had a dramatic turn around the early 2000s. And in Latin America, this has represented what Attilio Warren has called the turn to the left. Of course, in Latin America, this is an interesting book, which has been edited by Máximo Soso, has claimed that the argument of account of mass incarceration is not really sufficient because in many places we didn't have this mass incarceration, right? And therefore would not explain things that much. The problem of that in Brazil, we had neoliberalism and an increase in incarceration. So how could we think of this dilemma? How could we think of this new period in Brazil and the effects of neoliberalism after it was implemented during the welfare development period? So let's explore briefly this welfare developmentalism period of Brazil. First one is, we all know, reduction of inequality, an expansion of the state quite substantially. In my case study in Paraná, what we have is a dramatic increase of welfare developmentalism. For instance, the state governor increased public services and wages dramatically. It nationalized, privatized companies, and the prison units which were privatized became nationalized again. Expanded police forces, state prison staff, constructed 12 new prison units, and expanded vacancies from 5,000 to 15,000 vacancies in penitentiaries, not only provisional, but penitentiaries in the state. This means 140% increase during that period in terms of prison population. And this has all been done without any federal resource. So this was a decision of that state governor, which particularly was following that ideology. We can see the interesting process is that the expansion of incarceration was dramatic. We went from 15,000 prisoners to almost 30,000 prisoners in 10 years. So we doubled the prison population during a left-wing government. And what is more interesting is that not only the state governor increased prisons and made them more important and invested more on them, but also the relationship by which prison staff had to deal with inmates also was affected by that. Some of the important changes was that prisoners started to organize themselves according to this idea of being unionized, being collectives, being solidarity, and staff started to actually get into dialogues with these groups to try to find a middle ground of discipline with inmates and not on inmates as in the previous past. As you can see, inmates as a whole body being more organized amongst each other. And one interesting aspect of special prison staff is that they mentioned the change that this happened was a lot more judicial oversight on their duties and their behavior in prison during that period. So how can we conclude this whole these results of these 4 periods in my case study in particular, right? The first thing is that Wakan's punitive hypothesis in Brazil really falls in 2 big mistakes. And the first mistake is the neoliberal, and the second is the authoritarian issue that he claims without actually doing proper research in prison. In terms of the lack of democracy in Brazil, well, historically, there's a big problem in the claim of authoritarian containment. Historically, because containment began with the democratization of society as a means to humanize prisons and bring them into the rule of law. And the second problem is that pragmatically, containment has a deep democratic aspect, for it tries to respond to criminality without utilizing sheer state repression, sheer use of police custody and detentions. The second main problem with Wakan's thesis, which is quite popular in Brazil, is the idea of the authoritarian, of the neoliberal state. Historically, the problem here is that mass incarceration gains momentum before neoliberalism, and it's further increased with governments that react against it, expanding welfare as part of state expansion, state building. Theoretically, also, the problem is that there's no immediate relation between more neoliberalism, less welfare, increased punishment. That relationship is simply not there. And if I had to summarize then, what would be this penal containment of the democratic period? And I would say it would be summarized into 3 main features. The first one is that it's based, oops, let's see if I go back to it again. So the first one is that it's based in a democratic policy. So there's an effort to adapt to legal aspects. Second, it seeks to promote a dialogue as a strategy of control instead of sheer institutional violence. Third, it seeks to discipline individuals not as an autocratic body of individuals, but differently according to their sentences. In addition to that, there's a feature that neoliberal and increasing inequality, it's not its fundamental drive. Actually, it's driven by the attempt of the state to reduce crime without conceding to sheer violence. And also, the official discourse and practices of social justice under human rights or social inclusion is very important. So we're expanding incarceration, we're organizing imprisonment based on the discourse of humanism. And in addition to that, finally, the idea of discipline is also important, but it has a new shape in this contemporary moment. It's not based on the ideology of labor as it used to be. Actually, it's enforced toward protecting private property, and a lot of the discipline is self-imposed by inmates, which makes the discipline part of the autonomous organization of prison. And so, just so we can have a visual image of what this means in terms of period, I would claim that there's an important difference between the characteristics of the prison governance in the dictatorship, which is featured by this idea of custodial power, and the prison containment in the democratic period. But most importantly, that each single period, the social justice period, which with its judicialization affects the ones that come after. And also the idea of confinement would affect the ones after, and also the idea of welfare developmentalism. And this also leads us to reflect on the contemporary setting as a junction of a set of policies that have been trying to be implemented in a new democratic setting. So that said, thank you very much.
Thanks to you, Victor. Well, now we have Julienne Weegels. She's from the University of Amsterdam, and she's our discussant. Julienne, are you there?
I'm here, yes. And thank you also, Vitor, for this very exciting presentation. Actually, I want to commend both of or all 3 of the authors for their excellent work. It was very thought-provoking. in some way, in a lot of ways, very related to my own work as well in Nicaragua. So it was very exciting to think through a number of the things that you touch on. So I'm just going to give a few comments and then pose a few questions, and you guys can jump in on whichever you prefer. So first, like there are some key lines that I see. This attention, especially to the geographies and temporalities. So both taking, let's say, cases that are not typically taken from Brazil in like decentering in a way the Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo dominance of the debate by attending to different geographical locales of the Brazilian federal state. And looking very closely at these historical legacies, and I would say historical not only in the sense of, as Vitor does, from looking from the dictatorship right until the present, but also the longitudinal focus of both of your researches and how that renders such very interesting and kind of complexifies our ideas about the workings of the carceral state or the neoliberal state, both of which are often so much conflated in discourse. And I think that what's so useful, and I've been running into this myself as well, because the carceral expansive period in Nicaragua has also been under a government that calls itself socialist. So I've been running into this conundrum of the carceral state and the neoliberal state and kind of this conflation of the both of them in many, especially US-based scholarship, and really the need to pick apart, you know, what do we mean by a carceral state? And what do we mean by a neoliberal state? And are the two so intimately related, or are they actually not? And I think that both of your researches show that they produce different effects and different affects as well. And in that sense also that these carceral effects of neoliberalism are definitely present, but there are also carceral effects from post-neoliberal policies or socialist policies, or however we would like to call them, let's say, if we want to color them politically. So one of the things that I want to pick out kind of as a thing to comment on is the issue of what Jean and José Luis say of going for the exclusionary democracy rather than the carceral state concept. I think that I would argue actually that it's necessary to combine both, because I think that this criticism of, you know, using the carceral state as something to stick on everything that we don't like about mass incarceration indeed doesn't work. And that we need to really flesh out the differences or the different qualities of different carceral states that exist. But I do think that it's very useful to think about where is the carceral state located? What impulses the carceral state? What makes up this impulse to incarcerate and incarcerate more and more people? And in that way starts forming a carceral state. At some point in your presentation, Jean and José Luis, you mentioned the state does a number of things. Like the state decides who to put in prison, the state decides how long to put them there, the state decides where to allocate resources. And I think that, especially because you want to talk about exclusionary democracy, that in that sense, it's also important to pull apart, what do you mean by that state? Is it the judiciary? Is it politics? So what parts of the state are producing that carceral effect? And what, yeah, so who's driving, let's say, this exclusionary democracy or these carceral effects? Second of all, I think that the role that you give to temporalities and to the different actors that evolve over those different temporalities also allows for this fluid conception. In your papers, you talk about fluid regimes, regime transitions, you know, these points of bargaining, of conflict, And I think that that's a very useful way to think about things as arrangements, or because if we use the word regime, it indeed sometimes sounds so fixed, and it's tends to be much more of an arrangement. And with that, I think to go to my final point, there's something very particular about the role of particular people in these arrangements. Of really, you know, the micro level of a particular governor affecting a lot of the things going on, a particular prison warden affecting a lot of what is going on. And thinking there a little bit, and that's perhaps more in relation to Jean and José Luis's paper. You mentioned a lot the idea of charisma and respect and honra, also the, you know, when bringing the state back in this kind of capacity, this drawing on cultural codes, on machismo. And I was really thinking, you know, how, in a way, let's say, how do these people, so the micro level, what kind of power do they wield? You take a quite, you know, Weberian approach to it with this charismatic leadership kind of approach. But in how far could it be useful to think about the role of gendered codes and conceptions, and to really think about also gender as kind of co-opted, or I don't know whether to say co-opted, but gender as implied somehow in these patterns of subordination and in these patterns of power relations, making distinctions between good men and bad men, and very much implied in like these moral regimes that tend to, you know, be implied within these governance arrangements. I want to leave it at that, so you guys can pick up wherever you want on these comments.